It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you tonight's panelists, our two guest speakers, and one of our respondents. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis. I'm a faculty member here, focused in the International Education Policy Program, a program that I am the former director of. And as the resident Africanist at the Harvard Ed School, I'm particularly delighted that we have an Asquith Forum this evening that is focused on South Africa. The national elections of April 1994 marked the formal end of apartheid rule and a shift from authoritarian to democratic rule in South Africa. The new Constitution of South Africa included an unequivocal commitment to representative and participatory democracy, to accountability, transparency, and public involvement. The new democracy and the new outstanding Constitution is something that we're all eager to hear about tonight. Since 1996, South Africa's education policy has aimed to contribute to the democratic transformation of South African society. So it is my great pleasure that I welcome you here tonight to the forum, Racial Equity in Education. How far has South Africa come? Let me introduce to you tonight's panelists. Helen Ladd, Ted Fiske, and Alistair Whitten. Helen Ladd, or Sunny as she is known as, is the Edgar Thompson Professor of Public Policy Studies and Professor of Economics at Duke University, where she's also the Associate Director of the Sanford Institute. I'm pleased to welcome her back to Harvard, as she's previously been a faculty member here, first in the City and Regional Planning Program, and then at the Kennedy School of Government. Professor Ladd has also taught at Dartmouth College and at Wellesley College. Sunny graduated with a BA from Wellesley, a master's degree from the London School of Economics, and a PhD in economics from Harvard. Most of her current work focuses on education policy. She's the editor of Holding Schools Accountable, Performance-Based Reforms in Education, which was published by Brookings Institution in 1996. And she has co-authored, with her husband, Ted Fiske, the book When Schools Compete, A Cautionary Tale, which draws lessons from the U.S., from New Zealand's experience with self-governing schools and with parent choice and competition. From 1996 to 1999, Sunny co-chaired a National Academy of Sciences Committee on Education Finance. In that capacity, she co-edited two books, the background papers, which are entitled Equity and Adequacy of Education Finance, and the final report entitled Money Matters, Financing America's Schools. During the last few years, she's written articles on charter schools, on school-based accountability, market-based reforms in education, parental choice and competition, intergenerational conflict and the willingness to support education, and the effects of HUD's Moving to Opportunity program on educational opportunities and outcomes. Currently, she's working on teacher quality and student achievement based on North Carolina data. But Sunny has an equally sterling record outside of education circles in the area of state and local public finance. She's written extensively on the fiscal limitations of growth, property taxation, intergovernmental aid, state economic development, and the fiscal problems of U.S. cities. She's a past president of the National Tax Association and is active in the Association for Public Policy and Management. Sunny has been awarded 2 Fulbright grants, which supported her work in New Zealand back in 1998 and in South Africa in 2002. Edward Fiske, or Ted, as he is known as, is an internationally known education writer and editor. Formerly the education editor of the New York Times, Ted has written on topics ranging from American higher education to primary school reform in Southeast Asia, New Zealand, and most recently South Africa, the focus of tonight's discussion. Educated at Wesleyan University, Ted earned master's degrees in theology from Princeton Theological Seminary and in political science from Columbia University, and he's been awarded several honorary doctorates. Mr. Fiske joined the New York Times back in 1964 as a news clerk, and after serving as religion editor, he became the education editor in 1974. He edited the New York Times' quarterly education supplements. And in 1983, he authored an award-winning series on Japanese schools. During that time, he also wrote the book Smart Schools, Smart Kids, which was a study of systemic school reform in the United States. But in 1991, Ted left the Times to pursue other writing interests related to education, and he hasn't stopped. In 93 and 94, he was in Cambodia working with the International Rescue Committee on a UNICEF-sponsored cluster school project. He also worked with the Asian Development Bank and authored Using Both Hands, an analysis of the situation of girls and women in education in Cambodia. Ted's journalistic travels have taken him all over the globe. He's conducted education and training assessments for the Academy for Educational Development in the former Soviet Union and for the United States Information Agency in Alaska and Russian Far East. He's been commissioned by UNESCO to write for them, including the final report of the World Forum on Education for All in Dakar, commissioned by the World Bank for a study on the politics of school decentralization, as well as for the Aga Khan Foundation, USAID, and I'm sure several other organizations. He is well known, especially by those of us who have had children in college or have children in high school today, for the best-selling Fiske Guide to Colleges, an annual publication that has become a standard part of the college admissions literature for 2 decades now. And he's recently added to that reference work with two other volumes, the Fiske Guide to Getting into the Right College and the Fiske New SAT Insider's Guide. He continues to be a regular contributor to the International Herald Tribune. Tonight, we've asked Sonny and Ted to discuss their new book, and it's always much nicer to have someone else do the advertisement than to have to do it yourself. Their new book, Elusive Equity, Education Reform in Post-Apartheid South Africa, which was published this past July by Brookings Institution. Allow me now to introduce my fellow respondent, Alistair Whitten. Al is a doctoral candidate in the Community and Schools program here at the Graduate School of Education. And he's a master's alumnus of the School Leadership Program. Al has over 20 years of experience teaching and leading schools in Cape Town, South Africa. Prior to arriving at Hugsy in September 2001, he was the principal of Zerilda Park Primary School in the rather tough township of Lavendale Hill. Here he redefined the school-community relationships, building a partnership that served the community and secured the school environment. This work led to the Safe Schools program, which he coordinated for several years, and it now extends to over 200 schools in the Western Cape Province. He's interested in developing models for mutually beneficial school-community relationships and is actively engaged in his work at the Principal Center here at Harvard in defining new leadership models. I'm very pleased that Al has joined us tonight to engage with us in a discussion of South Africa's efforts to use education to transform society, particularly through the reduction of racial inequalities in schools and other educational institutions. Let me turn it over now to Sonny and to Ted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're delighted to be here, and thank you for all coming out on this cold evening. I suspect that many of you are here because you're fascinated, as Ted and I are, by the whole transformation process in South Africa. We believe, and I suspect many of you would agree with this, that education is central to that transformation process. It's important to the process for a number of reasons. One being that the state education system itself was a tool of the apartheid government. Second, the school children and schools themselves played an active role in the long struggle against the apartheid system. And then finally, the new government and most people involved in South Africa recognize the importance of education to the new South Africa. It's important not only for its own sake, but also because of the role that it can play in promoting other social goals and economic goals for the country. Now, the goal of our study, which is embodied in the book, Elusive Equity, is to evaluate how far South Africa has come in fashioning a more racially equitable system in this post-apartheid period. The framework for the book, and the conceptual framework as we think about equity, involves three different concepts of equity. The first one is equity defined as race-blind treatment or equal treatment in the policy arena. Second is equal educational opportunity. And what we mean by that second one is that students of different races have access through the school system to equal quality education. And then the third concept of equity is educational adequacy. The South Africans don't use that term adequacy. We pulled that from all our work in the U.S. and elsewhere, where the notion here is that it's important to have an education system that provides an education that's adequate or sufficient for the goals that you're trying to meet, where those goals in this case are to allow all racial groups in South Africa to participate fully in the political and economic life of the country. Now, our methodology involved various different aspects. As Suzanne mentioned, we spent 6 months in South Africa in 2002, where I was teaching at the University of Cape Town, and together we were doing research for this book. And we have a number of sources of information, but the one I want to highlight is the source at the bottom of that list, the unpublished data on all schools, every single school and every single teacher in 2 of the country's 9 new provinces. Now, there's always a danger when you're looking at a country if you just focus on 2 of the provinces rather than all of them, but we had limited time and data is limited in some of the provinces. But we chose these provinces carefully to represent 2 extremes. On the one hand, we have Eastern Cape, which is in the dark blue on the screen, which was a new province that was formed out of parts of the old white Cape province, and then out of 2 major African homelands, Ciskei and Transkei. Transkei is where Nelson Mandela is from. So as a result, it's not surprising that a large portion of the population in Eastern Cape, about 86%, is African. Those Africans are the ones living in these homelands. The white population is quite small in the Eastern Cape. It's only 5.2%. But given the homelands and the role they played during the apartheid system, it's not surprising that the poverty rate in Eastern Cape is so high. It's about 64% as of 1996. So we've got a very rural, very poor, very African province. Our other province is the Western Cape, which is right next to the Eastern Cape, but very different. This is one of the 2 wealthiest provinces in the country, the other one being Gauteng, where Pretoria and Johannesburg are. Western Cape, if you look down near the bottom of the green column, you'll see has a much higher proportion of white people. In 1996, about 21% of the population was white. The poverty rate is a lot lower in the Western Cape at about 18%, and it's much less rural. The one unusual fact about the Western Cape is its very high proportion of coloreds. These are people of mixed race, and a lot of them are Malays who came in with the Dutch. During the apartheid period, the whole Cape area was a labor preference area for coloreds, so they were able to get jobs before Africans, and the result of that is a very high proportion of coloreds. During this talk, sometimes I'll refer to Africans, sometimes to coloreds, sometimes I'll put the 2 together in the category of black, as distinguished from white. Some of the provinces also have Indians. Indians are a much smaller group in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape, so I won't be saying much about them. Let me start with the notion of equal treatment. So this is the first equity criterion. During the apartheid period, there was tremendously unequal treatment by the races. The students were separated into separate schools by their race, and these separate schools were operated by 15 separate departments of education. There were 4 departments serving the urban areas, a department for running the schools for African students, one for colored students, one for Indian students, one for white students. And then there were 10 separate departments, one in each of the homelands or territories. So those were all serving African students in these rural, impoverished areas of the country. And then there was one national non-operating department. Now the funding across these departments was egregiously unequal. At the height of apartheid, there was at least a 10-to-1 differential between the funding per pupil on behalf of students in the white schools compared to the students in the poorest of the homelands. Now, that changed by the end of the apartheid period, as spending during the last 5 or 10 years of the apartheid period was increased to try to improve education for the blacks, but even at the end there was a 3.5-to-1 ratio. So during the apartheid period, education was separate and grossly unequal by the race of the student. So the new government came in 1994, and there were dramatic changes. It worked immediately to set up a single national unified Department of Education. But this National Department of Education was then operating through the provinces, through a system that the South Africans refer to as cooperative, or it's a cooperative intergovernmental system. So what happens with respect to education is that the funding comes from the national government, and it gets distributed to the 9 new provinces in the form of a block grant for education, health, and other social services. And then the new provincial parliaments allocate that money between education and health and the other services. At the national level, there are also norms and standards that are established in consultation with the ministers of education from each of the provinces that have to do with the distribution or the allocation of teacher slots across schools, and also with the allocation of funding for non-personnel purposes across schools. And then the other thing that is important in this post-apartheid period is that they gave a lot of power to the individual schools, whether these be former white schools or former black schools. Each school has now an elected school governing body. So SGB stands for School Governing Body. And those school governing bodies have a reasonable amount of authority. They have authority to determine the language, which will be the medium of instruction in the school, whether it's going to be English or Afrikaans or one of the 9 official African languages. And they also have power to set school fees, and I'll talk more about that later. They have a lot of control over who gets admitted to the school, but the key fact in the new South Africa is they can no longer discriminate by the race of the student. So the bottom line in terms of these new policies is race is removed from all of the policies. Funding, money gets allocated much more on a per student basis. It has nothing to do with the race of the student. All students are allowed, or no students are prohibited from going to a particular school based on their race. So let's look at what has happened in terms of initially access to schools. What I've got here is information that we put together that's organized by schools grouped into the department that formerly ran these schools in the pre-1994 period. So the first column, the dark blue, is the schools run by the Department of Education and Training for African students. And so those schools are no longer run by that department, but we can identify them in our data set as formerly run by DET. So what emerges clearly from that is those schools are still serving all Africans. 99.7% of the students are Africans. The next column is for the schools that were serving colored students, or were operating the schools for colored students. HOR stands for House of Representatives, and that was set up for the colored. And as you can see, 93% of the students they serve are still colored, but we now have some Africans in those schools. And then the final column is the schools served by the so-called House of Assembly, and this is the schools operated for white students. And what you can see is about 66, or 2 out of 3 of the students, 63%, or 2 out of 3 of the students in those schools are still white, but now those schools have been opened up to coloreds, who now account for, according to our estimates, 25% of the students, and Africans, who are about 6% of those students. Let me quickly go to the Eastern Cape, which is the poorer, blacker, many fewer white students here. Let's focus on the first column first. That's Transkei. So these are all the schools that were in the Transkei that are now just part of the new Eastern Cape. Not surprisingly, basically 100% of the students in those schools are Africans. That's because they're in these rural areas that were the rural homelands, and who lives in those areas? It's all Africans. Same is true for Ciskei. If you go way over to the right, to the green column, you see the white schools in the Eastern Cape now have about, on average, about 56% white students, about 30% Africans, and about 11% coloreds. All the whites, with a few exceptions here and there, are still in both the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, are in the schools formerly run for whites, and you've got movement of colored students into the former whites schools, and you've got some movement of Africans in the urban areas into the former colored schools. This is really important to keep in mind. I mean, you can say, well, how much integration has there been? Well, if you're talking about integration, you're talking just about those former white schools. They're a small part of the story, especially in the Eastern Cape. They're a tiny part of the story. The key point is the Africans are still, and will always be, because of their numbers and where they're living, in schools that were formerly operated just for African students. So it's important to go beyond just the question of integration and ask the question, well, you know, what's happened to the funding and the resources in those schools? So let's just look quickly at what's happened in terms of public resources across the provinces. What I've got here is information across the 9 provinces, with the focus initially on the Western Cape, the wealthy province, and the Eastern Cape. In 1995, so right at the beginning of the new South Africa, spending in the Western Cape per pupil was about 2.5 times that in the Eastern Cape. By 2001, that ratio had fallen to 1.4. So dramatic progress toward convergence. Not all the way there, although this data stops in 2001, and since then there's been additional convergence. And that was not done easily. To affect this change involved dramatic layoffs of teachers in the Western Cape, because spending in the Western Cape had to be cut way back, and there were teacher strikes and all sorts of things. But there was a strong commitment to this new idea that it was important to provide resources on an equal basis, in this case across provinces, but then also across schools within provinces. So the second line here, the coefficient of variation across 9 provinces, just indicates a significant reduction in the variation from 39% or 0.39 down to 0.22, which is about a 40% reduction. So by 2001, they hadn't gotten all the way to equalizing resources across provinces, some of which are much blacker than others, but they made a lot of progress. Now let's look at what happens across schools within a province, and this data is for the Western Cape. Now, there are national norms that apply to each province, and so the provinces are told they're supposed to allocate teachers in a certain way, which is basically on a per pupil basis across all schools. Now, it's not quite per pupil. There's no race involved in it, but it's not quite per pupil because they do pay attention to the fact that some types of courses, like graphic design, you might want to teach with slightly smaller classes than than some other type of course. It turns out the former white schools are more likely to offer those sorts of courses than is the case for the former African schools. So what we end up with in that first row is what I would call a dramatic convergence of learners per educators. That's like students per pupil, but I've used the South African language here. But we haven't gotten all the way to convergence because of some of these quirks in the distribution formula. So these are just in the former African schools, there are now about 38 students per educator, in contrast to the white schools where there are about 36. So you can look at it either way. You can say there's dramatic convergence here, or you can say they haven't quite gotten all the way to complete convergence. On the spending line, this is spending on behalf of students in the former African schools versus colored schools versus white schools. And the numbers, the index numbers in parentheses at the bottom on that green row, just are ratios relative to the African schools. So what this says is that the spending on behalf of students in the white schools in the Western Cape is about 30% higher than that on behalf of students in the former black schools. But I remind you, these white schools are now serving both whites and blacks. It's whites and middle-class blacks and middle-class colored students. Now, that differential is reflecting the difference in student-teacher ratios, but it's also reflecting the fact that more qualified teachers are paid more than less qualified teachers, and you've got a higher proportion of more qualified teachers in the former white schools than in the former African schools. So where are we on the first criterion of equity, which is the criterion of equal treatment across the races? We would argue, and we do argue in the book, that the country has made just dramatic progress in setting up a system in which race no longer plays an explicit role. That doesn't mean you don't get racial differences, but race no longer plays a specific role. And I think the country needs to be praised greatly for this dramatic change that they have implemented in a very short period of time. But the second part of this is there's been much less progress with respect to equity defined either as equal educational opportunity or as educational adequacy. And that's for all sorts of reasons having to do with funding and capacity constraints that I will come to. So let's think about equal educational opportunity, or unequal, as the case was during the apartheid period. During apartheid, I've already talked about the fact that current resources, current account spending per pupil just differed dramatically in the black schools compared to the white schools. But you can also talk about the differences with respect to investment in school facilities. In 1991, estimates suggest a shortage of at least 29,000 primary school classrooms and 14,000 secondary school classrooms for schools serving blacks. But it's not just the numbers of classrooms, it's the amenities in those schools and classrooms, like toilets, electricity, media centers, or libraries. Big differences. And then also during apartheid, you have a huge difference in the qualifications of the teachers. So you've got teachers in the black schools in the homelands or in the black schools in the townships in the urban areas, and they are much less well qualified in general than the teachers in the white schools. So that's the situation during apartheid. What's happened since then? Well, the big policy that was implemented as part of the norms and standards for non-personnel spending across schools, and there's a lot of hoopla as this finally was introduced in 2000. That program doesn't talk about race, but it does take account of the fact that schools serving poor communities, often colored or African communities, are impoverished and need more resources. And this norms and standard program directed each province to take 40% of, I just said it wrong, 60% of the funds and make sure that those funds go disproportionately to the poor schools. So 60% of the funds have to go to 40% of the schools, the lowest 40%. So this got a lot of publicity. But our view is this hasn't done very much. There wasn't much money left for non-personnel spending after all the teacher salaries were paid. So this represents a really tiny part of the education budget. So this hasn't served to compensate for a lot of the disinvestment in the past in the schools serving blacks and Africans. If you think about progress on capital investments, we get a similar picture. There was some building of new schools in the Eastern Cape and various other places early on, but then that slowed way down. Some progress on trying to improve teacher quality in the former black schools, but they still have a long way to go. And let me just briefly show you some data. This relates to the capital spending issue. I've just pulled out one example. This is media centers, like libraries in schools. The top, you've got Eastern Cape, where even in the year 2000, only 10% of the schools had media centers of any type. Western Cape, huge difference in the Western Cape. 58% of the schools in 2000 had media centers. So we've got a big difference in 2000. We also had a big difference in 1996, which are the black bars. One major point of this figure is to show that those differences that existed in 1996 still exist in 2000. There hasn't been any narrowing of those differentials. Let's talk just quickly about teacher characteristics, and this data I'm presenting here is for the Eastern Cape, where there were huge numbers of unqualified teachers. Now, let's look at the bottom line here, the bottom two, the part of the figure that's in green, because that's just for primary schools. Technically, in South Africa now, a teacher is qualified if she has or he has a matriculation degree, it's like a high school degree, plus 3 years. That's 13 on a scale that goes from 10 to 17. What that first green row says that in 1997, the average qualifications by this measure were 12.6. By 2001, things had gotten a little better, but the average teacher still was unqualified by this measure of 13. And that measure doesn't give a true picture. I mean, that's just a quantity measure of the qualifications of teachers. If you take into account the fact that many of these teachers in these schools were trained in schools as part of a system that was designed to be dysfunctional, the qualities would seem even lower than emerges from these figures. And you can look at the bottom line with the percent unqualified. There's been some progress over time, but they still have a very long way to go. Now, there are a number of other issues that come up on this issue of equal opportunity, and I need to give my husband a little chance to talk, so I'm going to let him talk about curriculum issues, and then I'm going to come back and talk about school fees. Okay.
As Sonny mentioned at the very beginning, the education system was very important to sustaining the whole apartheid system, and curriculum was critical to this role that education was playing in a couple of ways. First of all, there was simply the content. The history curriculum, for example, were very much written from the point of view of the whites who had all the power. There was praise for the achievements of the Afrikaners. Blacks were portrayed in stereotypes. You never had Zulus, you always had fearsome Zulus. And so both the content, but then also the levels at what people were allowed to study. There were huge restraints on how far Africans and coloreds could go in school. They weren't allowed to study advanced math and science. And as Prime Minister Verwoerd once famously remarked back when he was the Minister of Education, it would be immoral to teach blacks up to a level which would equip them for jobs that they realistically could never have. So this was the way the curriculum was seen. So when the new democratic government came in 1994, they understood very well, as most transitional governments do, the symbolic power of curriculum. This was a way to send out some real signals very quickly about the values of the new government. And it was also a way, they saw the curriculum as a way of reversing the traditional pattern. So curriculum was a way of enhancing opportunity, not limiting opportunity. So it was important then to send out these powerful political signals. And what these signals had to do was to say we're going to have a curriculum that reflects, where the content reflects the values of the new South Africa, values of democracy, values of equality of the races, and so forth. The curriculum had to be non-authoritarian. The old school system was very top-down and delivered in a very heavy, the instruction was delivered in a very heavy-handed, authoritarian way. You couldn't have a situation where you simply replaced one orthodoxy with another. It needed to develop a non-authoritarian way of organizing the curriculum, and it also had to be delivered in a democratic fashion at the school and the classroom level. There had to be a sense of democracy. And so in order to build these values into the new curriculum that was going to serve the new democratic government, decision makers in the Ministry of Education and elsewhere, and this was a debate which actually began in the early 90s, even before the end of apartheid, embraced the concept of outcomes-based education, which is, I'm sure, something that most of you understand. And this was incorporated into what was known as Curriculum 2005. It took its name from the year that it was supposed to be fully implemented. And it was released the curriculum was published in March 1997. They had a huge rally on the steps of Parliament in Cape Town, and they released 2005 balloons, all in the color of in the South African colors. So this was very important symbolically. The problem was that the curriculum had, perhaps it had been rushed through, but there were the need to send out political signals trumped some of the educational soundness of it. There were major technical problems with outcomes-based education, or Curriculum 2005. For one thing, it was very complicated. There was 12 general objectives and 66 specific objectives in 8 curriculum areas. It just got to be very complicated. For some reason, really strange language crept in, so teachers were no longer teachers, they were facilitators. And it was very difficult for a lot of the teachers to administer this curriculum. One of the emphases, in order to be so democratic, was that the curriculum would not just come down like Moses' tablets from on high, but it would be developed at the local level, involving the community, be very democratic in the content. But the problem is, as you can all well understand, teachers don't tend to necessarily they're not trained to be curriculum writers, and they didn't necessarily have the time or the skills or even the inclination not only to teach, but also to develop curriculum. So there were huge problems here with the quality of the content of the curriculum. Teachers had not been well trained to do this. In order to do the training, for which they didn't have a lot of resources, they adopted a cascade model where one person would teach 4 or 5 people, and they would then go teach 4 or 5 others, and you would multiply it out, so you finally got down to the local level and everybody was trained. But the problem was the trainers didn't always necessarily understand, so there was a lot of blind leading the blind in the training. So the training turned out to be have huge practical problems. These problems became clear very soon, within a year or so of the implementation. And the Ministry of Education, to its credit, took note of the problems that were being documented with this inability, the lack of training, and the complexity and so forth. And Kader Asmal was the Minister of Education, and he said, wait a minute, we've got to look at this. And then they appointed a review committee, and they acknowledged that these complaints were legitimate and said, we're going to make some changes. This took huge political courage on Asmal's part, because as the ANC, which the African National Congress, which was running the government, is notoriously thin-skinned. And this was the first time that the new democratic government had come along and say, we blew something. We made a mistake, we've got to do some revisions. So they did make some reforms in order to address some of these problems. When you ask then, what does this mean for equal educational opportunity? It turned out that the OBE, Outcomes-Based Education / Curriculum 2005, really worked fairly well in the former white schools, what they called technically former Model C schools, because a lot of these schools had really been doing this anyway, and they had well-prepared teachers who could handle it. So it wasn't a huge problem in these schools. But it put a huge burden on the schools serving the disadvantaged populations, especially the African and the colored, because they simply didn't have the teachers who had the background, because they had been systematically deprived of training during the apartheid era. And as I mentioned before, they didn't have the media centers, and if you're going to have a curriculum where it's up to the teachers to come up with a lot of the content, you have to have resources at the disposal of the teacher in order to do this. So one of the great ironies that we constantly marveled at is that OBE, because at least on the symbolic level and on the political level and in terms of sending out signals about the value, it remains really popular. It was hard to find people who would criticize the concept of OBE, but is that the microphone or is it? God. Good. Yeah. But on the other hand, there were huge problems. So what you found was people say, yes, it's making my life miserable, I have a tough time, but I really like the ideas behind it. So you had a system which was supposed to promote equality and level the playing field. In practical terms, it really didn't do much. And as a matter of fact, it may have ended up making the playing field even a little bit more unlevel.
So there's another major issue with respect to educational opportunity, and that has to do with school fees, which I alluded to earlier. All of the other measures of resources that I put up earlier were public resources, paid for out of public taxes. South Africa decided early on to not only allow individual schools to charge fees, but to encourage them to do so. And so each school has its school governing body, and that school then votes to decide whether to charge fees and the level of those fees. So you end up with different amounts of fees across schools. Now, there had been a lot of discussion about whether schools should be allowed to serve school fees, and the major justification, this is one of several justifications, but this is clearly the major one, was the importance to many people of trying to keep middle-class families, both white and black families, in the public school system. And the notion was, if you didn't allow the former white schools, or the schools serving middle-class families, to charge fees, the families would exit from the public school system and go over to the private system, and that would be undesirable, and you'd set up a new bifurcated system, this one not based on race, but one based on who could pay for the private schools. So they just didn't want that to happen. And so they let schools charge fees, and what this does, in effect, is allow the former white schools, now serving middle-class blacks as well as whites, to charge a lot more money. Now, the schools serving Africans are permitted to charge fees as well. But there's a lot of poverty in this country, and so not surprisingly, they're not able to charge much in the way of fees. So this fee policy has ended up leading to large differences across schools, and these data illustrate that for the Western Cape. First row is the annual fee charged. It's our estimate of that from the data that we had. So what you see is the former white schools charge huge fees relative to the former African schools. And then this bottom row is important, and it puts things in perspective. With the school fees, the schools often use them to hire teachers, and those are called school governing body teachers as opposed to the state-paid teachers. So if you go over to the former white schools, what the 28.5 says is that on average the white schools were able to augment the publicly state-paid teachers by about 30%. And some schools were able to do a lot more than that. Some schools were able to double the number of teachers, whereas the former African schools and the former colored schools weren't able to augment the number of teachers very much at all. So these school fees are really leading to significant differences across schools in the quality of education provided. And we in the book make some suggestions about what to do about that, and the Ministry of Education is rethinking the school fees as well. Let me turn now to the third criterion of equity, this notion of educational adequacy. And once again, what we mean by that is we're asking the question, to what extent are schools now providing an education that is adequate to meet the needs of the new South Africa? Africans are expected now to participate both in the political and in the economic life of the country in ways that they were not expected to do under the apartheid system. Now, it's always hard to figure out what's adequate. We know that the old system was inadequate, and so what we're looking for as we look at the data is trends, and we looked at whatever outcome measures that we had available to us. So there are some international tests that were given in 1995, or South Africa participated in some of the international tests in 1995 and 1999. What you see is South Africa performs abysmally, even compared to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now that's reflecting the education system during the apartheid period primarily. We were looking at data for 2001 and 2002, and you still see very high retention and dropout rates for blacks, low enrollment of blacks in math and science courses. The one I want to focus on here just very briefly is the matriculation pass rates. There are not external tests for third graders or sixth graders. The only tests that are available are the matriculation tests for students as they're leaving high school. So not everybody's taking these tests. It's only the students who make it to 12th grade and then who sit for these tests. But it's the only outcome measure that is publicly available. So the government has picked up on this measure as a measure of success and measure of outcomes, as has the media for lack of other outcome measures. So let's look at what's happened to matriculation pass rates. Now this data goes over a long period of time. It's starting in 1975 on the left, and we end up with 2002 over for the last dots. And the line is at 1994, the end of apartheid. So let's just focus on the top line, which is the pass rate. So this is the number of passes divided by the number of candidates sitting, and this is what gets all the publicity. So one way of reading this looks good, in fact. You see good in the following sense. You see, during the apartheid period, a decline in this pass rate. Not steady decline, but a clear decline. And then apartheid ends in 1994. You see things leveling off. And then starting in about 1999, it looks like things have really turned the corner. Not surprising, the Ministry of Education has publicized these results. Looks like pass rates are turning up. The bottom line is pass rates with endorsement. Those are, it's like with distinction. It's the students who get endorsement then are eligible to go to university. And you get a slight tick up in that rate as well. So this is the information that one gets through the public media. But let me show it in a slightly different form. Pass rates are the number of students who pass divided by the number of candidates. Look at the top row of this. This is, top set of dots. This depicts what happened to the number of candidates, growing quite dramatically during the apartheid period. And then we get to about 1997, and we see a quite significant drop-off in the candidates. That can account for the rise in the pass rate. You've got the denominator going way down, and then the pink dots tell you what happened to the number of passes. And what this says is the number of students passing this exam in the post-apartheid period has stayed relatively constant. So this is our conclusion about sort of what's happening in terms of outcomes. It's an imperfect outcome measure, but there has not been a significant increase in the numbers of students who are passing this exam, and we use other data as well to show that this sort of evidence of increasing pass rates either at the national level or at the provincial level or for individual schools that I get identified as doing terrifically. A lot of what looks like progress is in fact arises from the number of students not taking the exam or dropping out of school. We've done a lot of analysis of that in the book. I should emphasize this is not a phenomenon unique to South Africa. Whenever you put emphasis on pass rates on tests, it's important to keep in mind that if you reduce the denominator, you can raise that pass rate. Anyway, so we conclude that in terms of adequacy, the country hasn't made much progress. Now, that's not surprising. I mean, to change an education system in this short a period of time is a huge task. And a lot of the students who are taking the matric are students who started their education during the apartheid period. And so this shouldn't discourage one too much, but it should make one understand that there's a lot more that needs to be done in order to move the whole system forward. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about these challenges, but I want to put them on the table. There are a lot of additional challenges in addition to the ones we've already talked about, like investing in schools and improving teacher quality. There are issues related to language and education policy. South Africa has 11 official languages, English, Afrikaans, and 9 African languages. They haven't fully sorted out, both at the national level, how to deal with all these languages and at the school level. And part of the reason that it's hard for them to grapple with all of this is because of the history of apartheid. Language policy itself, in general and at the school level, was used as a tool during apartheid to separate Africans into their ethno-linguistic groups, even to separate the whites. During the apartheid period, the white Afrikaners were separated into schools that were separate from the English-speaking whites. So there's a lot of politics. And then English became the language of opportunity for Africans. So a lot of Africans want to learn English, but it's a very, very complicated story, and it's hard for them to move to the next step. Quality assurance and support. A lot of the emphasis initially is on moving resources around and trying to make sure that schools have equal amounts of resources. The South Africans understand that it's time to pay a lot more attention than they have in the past to the quality issues, but that's hard for them as well. And again, this reflects the apartheid legacy. At the end of the apartheid system, the teachers were rebelling against this autocratic, authoritarian regime, and the teachers hated to have the apartheid government come in and evaluate them. That notion of teachers not wanting to be evaluated has carried over into the new system. And it would be unfair and inappropriate for the new government to come in and evaluate teachers by new standards given the low quality training that many of these teachers had, which is why we always talk about quality assurance and support. But there are complicated issues, and South Africa has not they've tried to move forward, but they haven't made much progress on that. And then, of course, the new major problem for the education system has to do with HIV/AIDS, dramatic increases in that affects education in major ways, both because of its disproportionate impact on the teachers and the teaching profession, and on the sorts of students, and the fact that there are lots of AIDS orphans and a lot of children who need to stay at home caring for family members. One might ask just quickly, and I'm going to end in about 2 minutes, why hasn't the country been able to make more progress on the equity concept of equal educational opportunity, or in terms of adequacy? Part of the answer is clearly the huge legacy of apartheid, which I've mentioned a couple of times. The other reason is there was no increase in inflation-adjusted funding for education. Now, here's a country that understood that it needed to invest in education, but it needed to invest in all sorts of other things as well, housing and health and whatever. But spending wasn't increased, and the reason, there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that they were already spending a high proportion of gross domestic product, about 7% on education at the end of the apartheid period, and they didn't want to increase that. That was a high percentage by international standards, so the only way they could increase spending was to have the economy grow. But they were operating in a world financial environment that was sending signals loud and clear to them that they had to have an austere budget, which they introduced in 1966, the GEAR budget, with the goal of which, consistent with the whole Washington consensus view, is that you're supposed to reduce the deficit and try to make the country attractive, keep inflation down, and the idea was you were going to attract lots of foreign investment. Turns out it didn't work in terms of attracting foreign investment, so the economy didn't grow, so there were no new real inflation-adjusted revenues for spending. Now, there were also all sorts of capacity constraints. Even if they had had additional funding, some people would have said, well, some of this money might have been wasted because of the lack of human capacity and managerial capacity throughout the system. And that's true to a certain extent. The Eastern Cape is just a prime example of this. It was formed out of these dysfunctional homelands that had been designed to be dysfunctional. You put those governments together, you don't have a good functioning government. The new Ministry of Education within the Eastern Cape, was really struggling. The whole system was struggling. So you don't have capacity at the provincial level. But you didn't have capacity at the national level as well. There were real capacity problems as they were trying to roll out the curriculum. There was a real lack of capacity there. So lack of human capacity throughout the system was a serious problem, and we could go into that in a lot more detail. In terms of outlook for equity, racial equity as the country goes forward, there are some real positive things that have happened and that set the stage. Most children still are in public schools. About 97 or 98% of students are still all in public schools. That's positive, I think, as they go forward. There are structures in place. This federal system, which has the revenue raised at the federal level as opposed to at the provincial level where you've got big differences in wealth, is a good thing. The norms and standards notion at the federal level trying to promote equity is all a good thing. But there are tremendous uncertainties as the country goes forward. If they can't do something about their very high unemployment rates, their very high poverty rates, it's going to be very difficult to improve the education system. And then you're going to have education vying with other functional areas for additional spending. There are lots of other functional areas, but the health related to AIDS is a key one there. So, last slide, what lessons emerge from this? Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. Let me just briefly mention 3. You can't go through this whole story without coming away with an incredible appreciation of the importance of history. History matters. It matters for understanding sort of the racial context. It matters for understanding what changes they've made to date. It matters for understanding the difficulties of making additional changes as they go forward. Second lesson, race-blind treatment is not sufficient when the playing field is not level. An obvious point, and very obvious in the South African context where the playing field was so unleveled, this notion that you can come along and say, okay, we're now going to be race-blind and have equal treatment for everybody, that's not going to lead to equal outcomes or equitable outcomes. And then finally, this notion that money and capacity matters. Here you have a country that was strongly committed to making major changes in its education system. It did a lot, moved resources from the Western Cape to provinces like the Eastern Cape, did a huge amount, but you can only go so far without additional funding. And so while we don't have evidence from South Africa that additional funding would have been used for terrific purposes, we can make a strong case that in the absence of that additional funding, it would have been very hard for them to do some of the other things that would have been needed to promote equal educational opportunity. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's on. Thank you very much. I want to compliment the two of you. The two of you have written a very coherent analysis that runs across all the major elements of education reform in South Africa, be it the curriculum, school governance, devolving financing authority to school boards, educational inputs, etc. And you've done so using these three standards of equity, which have not been applied to South African analysis previously. So I think you've made a great contribution through that framework. Also, as you know, South African education scholarship has been characterized by a rich tradition of policy discourse analysis. Very high-level, sophisticated policy discourse, to be sure, higher than anything else I've seen on the continent, but it really suffers from a lack of an empirical basis, and therefore it's had really limited lessons for practice. It's been, when it has had some empirical basis, tended to focus on policy fidelity, which I think has been a problem. And I think your work makes an important contribution to the empirical base of knowledge for understanding South African education. And here comes the but. Let me push you to talk about the implications of your analysis for practice. What are you going to be telling the educators when you go back to Cape Town? Or when you meet new teachers in KwaZulu-Natal, as I know you hope to do some work there. Let me also push you to comment on what the practice that you've observed implies for policy change and policy direction in South Africa. Because surely policy is not being implemented as designed from on top. And what the evidence that you saw of people reframing, redefining, taking ownership of policy as they put it into practice means a different kind of policy. And how should policymakers respond to that? Secondly, let me push you to talk comparatively. Both of you have written a good deal of work comparatively, whether you're comparing different states of the United States or you're comparing New Zealand with the United States. So how about South Africa? Is the situation in South Africa qualitatively different from that of other countries, or is it simply an extreme example of forces that exist elsewhere? And I know you asked this question in the book at the start, but I'm not so convinced you answered it by the end of the book, so I want to give you that opportunity. And my third question has to do with what I think is letting the government off much too lightly. There's a wonderful chapter, well, several chapters providing background, and you lay out how the macroeconomic forces called for a neoliberal approach, and poor education lost to that macroeconomic effort. But I and many other analysts like Bruce Fuller and Linda Chisholm and Everard Weber and Motala and Valley have argued that, in fact, the education leaders embrace the neoliberal approach, and that's why South Africa is one of the few countries in the world that charges fees at the primary level. If South Africa was so concerned about the international perspectives, as you argue, particularly about the percentage of expenditure that's going to education, and therefore put a lid on increasing educational financial resources for education. Why were they not concerned about the appalling practice of charging fees at the primary school level? And that seems to be a puzzle I'd like for you to discuss. I would like to, before we open it up, I'm going to ask Al Witten to share with us his reactions to the presentation, and then if we could get the panelists to respond, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I too want to commend you on a fine piece of work. I think it really builds into our research base back home. The other reason why I also enjoyed the work was because I found the reading quite accessible. And I believe that it's not only policymakers and researchers that will be able to read it, but also school teachers, parents, and principals. And I'm becoming increasingly concerned that the voices of those who are really at the grassroots level of practice are not being included in the educational discourse. So this piece really is quite accessible to them, and I hope that there will be some interaction with it in terms of going forward on future policy debates. I think you also spelt it well, the specifically educational context within which education takes place, and I thought I just needed to frame that within the slightly broader macro socio-economic levels within which South Africa is presently engaged with at the moment. South Africa has inherited a legacy of deep structural inequalities across society, across sectors in the country. And education and the focus on equity in education is but one of that. And so the challenge in terms of looking at how we strive for equity in education, I think cannot be delinked or isolated from the broader challenges of addressing many of the other needs within communities at a simultaneous level. I just want to underscore that point. Just speaking from personal experience, I remember that as a school principal when this flurry of policies between 1995 and 1999 came into schools. It really had a very big impact on teachers, especially teachers in the township schools and even the rural schools, I would argue. We were continually being held to standards that the white schools were holding up at that point in time. And from the side of the policymakers, there was very, very little sensitivity to the socio-economic context of the schools in the township and in the rural areas. And there was just, mass feeling of demoralization, depression, deep frustration at all levels. And it was a very, very difficult period that we came through in terms of this. My sense is now that the system may have settled in a bit better for a clearer and stronger focus to be pushed on areas of school improvement, because when we speak about equity, it has to be linked to school improvement. I also just want to add that when I speak about equity, I'd rather want to focus on the process of equity rather than the end goal or the outcome, because I think we have lots of work to do on it and still a very, very long way to go. But in focusing on the process, I think it should be continually subject to quite careful and critical scrutiny, as well as continued political pressure to prevent it from falling into the temptation of being used by politicians or policymakers just as symbolic rhetoric. So I think it's important that we continue looking at the process in which equity is being undertaken in the country. I just have one question in terms of, maybe two, but one in terms of the total financial resources in schools, and you allude to school fees as the key one. And I was wondering whether you had any data on other forms of school income, like fundraising and donation, the selling of state lands in previously white schools. Because my sense is that when that is added into the pot, your levels of inequality between your black schools and your former Model C or your white schools will be even greater. So I just like you to speak a bit more to that. And then just in terms of that too, like Sue mentioned earlier, I'd like also to know what some of the implications of this research is for improving our schools. I ask that because that's linked to my own interest in what do we do with this? Where do we take it to? We've argued very strongly that, and I think you do mention it in the book also, that, you know, in fact you mentioned it this evening, that majority Africans in African schools, majority colored in colored schools. So we've got no other option but to improve those schools where they are, whether they be in the rural areas or in the township areas. And when you work and think about teaching and education in those areas, it's about improving schools, but also simultaneously about improving those communities. And I don't see I can't, just in my own experience and work I've done, I just can't see the two being de-linked. And our own work before I came over here to South Africa was around looking at making our school a center or a hub for broader community development and transformation, and then coupling that to our own efforts at school improvement. And whilst we didn't have a proper evaluation done on it, we've seen some dramatic results in using that approach. Obviously, that approach would mean a certain redefinition of the roles of schools in communities like our townships or our rural areas, but also it would look at more cross-sectoral work between and within government ministries. So, for example, in a school situation, it's not only going to be the education department that moves through that school. It should be the health, it should be the justice department, social welfare department, all moving through that school in some synchronized effort around collective goals. So I was wondering, just in terms of your work, in terms of what you looked at in research and what's happening now in the country, if you've seen any of that happening. I do want to conclude by saying that you are right. The challenges in South Africa remain high levels of unemployment, AIDS and malnutrition and disease big. I didn't pick it up in the book, but in many of the township communities in the Western Cape, crime and violence, major problems that impact upon schools. And just in terms of that, I was wondering if that was also evaluating data on how that impacted on equity levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I'll turn the microphone over to our panelists to try to respond.
There's a lot of really great issues there. Just on the last point, I spent a lot of time visiting schools, and Sari was crunching the data, and that was sort of the way we divided things up. But I was in one school where the previous week it was right in the edge of the territory of two gangs, yeah. And the gangs periodically met to have their fights, and they were playing football, soccer. The students were playing soccer. And the gangs arrived to have a fight, so the coach told all the soccer players to lie down on the field. And the gangs had their fight, and then the gangs went away, and the kids got up and resumed their soccer game. So the whole question of, you hear these absolute horror stories that make your hair curl. Yeah. And, so you're absolutely right, especially when you get into the townships, that the violence and then, of course, the violence within the communities outside the school. I think we were very mindful in terms of our attitude toward the government of coming in as outsiders. As a journalist, I'm sensitive to the definition of the editorial writer as someone who comes down from the mountain after the battle and shoots the wounded. We were very sensitive of our role coming in as outsiders, and we wanted to try to respect the complexity of what they were doing. If you think about what they've done in 10 years, simply from a managerial point of view, take 15 or 17 departments, however you want to define it, you can count them different ways, and simply merging that into a single unified system, simply as a managerial problem, is huge. And so what they did in the kinds of changes they enacted in just a 10-year period were really quite remarkable. And we're also mindful, of course, that education is part of a broader social fabric. They had other things they had to do. They were working on the health system, on welfare, so this government, and housing, so the government coming in, we couldn't just say, well, why weren't you doing more in education? So we tried to be respectful of the complexity of what they were dealing with. I think there's one issue, and that is, I guess a couple of your questions have to do with a matter of political will. And what you see in South Africa is a lot of the emergence of a huge black middle class now. I mean, there's just been a lot of people who are kept under, kept down, and now suddenly they're free, and there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity among the black middle class. So it may very well be that the new fault line in South Africa is going to not be race, but class. And Bishop, some of you may have heard the remarks that Bishop Tutu made a month or two ago, attacking President Mbeki for not really being concerned with the poverty issue. And Mbeki, fired back. He was very sensitive to this. So the whole question of whether there is the political will to address the equity issue is a huge one in South Africa, as it is, of course, in the United States. In terms of the fees, and I'll turn over to Sonny, the way we think of it probably, given the particular history and the fact that you had a good white school system going, and which was becoming racially integrated, you wanted to preserve that. So that having the fee system was probably a reasonable alternative, even though Mandela has lent its name to the movement to abolish school fees in developing countries at the time. But now, 10 years into it, they've accomplished a lot. They've stabilized the system, so the whites are still in the system, as are the black middle class. And now's the time to start tweaking it. And we have a proposal in the at the end of the book as to how they might say, okay, you can have your fees if you want, but if you don't want to have the fees, we'll give you a certain amount, and you can decide not to have fees, because it costs the opportunity costs for the poor schools of collecting the fees are huge. So.
And just briefly, let me just pick up on the fee issue. One of the concerns in many developing countries in Africa and elsewhere with respect to school fees is if you charge them, you keep school students from enrolling in schools. We did some analysis, as careful as we could do with the available data, to see whether fees seem to be reducing enrollments. And the answer seems to be no, at least at the primary level. And there are lots of reasons for that. A lot of the schools serving the low-income kids aren't charging much in the way of fees, and when they have fees, they're not collecting them. So that major concern about fees is not the crucial one in the South African context. And I think we have to be careful. South Africans' enrollment rates are very high. I mean, our estimates are about 94% of the primary school kids. For a developing country, those are very high enrollment rates. So the issue more is the fees affect who can go to which type of school, and only middle-class students basically can go to the schools with the high fees. So there's that issue, but it's not the standard one that other countries are dealing with, and I think that's important to pay attention to. I want to just talk a little bit about this community. We agree fully that the socioeconomic characteristics that are the major legacy of apartheid are a central part of this whole story. And we say over and over again in the book, and we try to emphasize the poverty and the malnutrition and all of the challenges being faced. And so then the question is, well, what can the school system do within that? There are a couple things that need more attention and are getting more attention now. One simple one is nutrition, food programs within the schools. Those were, while we were there, in the Department of Health. They were not in the Department of Education or in the Ministry of Education. They've since been moved over to education, and we would support that, because if you have kids coming to school who haven't eaten, there's no way they can function in that school. Also, if you provide school lunches, you'll get kids coming to school, attending school. A lot of them are walking a long distance to get to school. So that's something that can be done immediately. And but there are issues there with corruption and all sorts of things. Eastern Cape had shut down its school feeding program because of concerns about corruption. So just delivering these programs can be hard. Now, the other aspect on communities, you talked about isn't there some way that you can bring the whole community into the school in some more significant way? In one sense, that's what the school governing bodies were designed to do. So under the apartheid system, you had the white schools with something comparable to school governing bodies, and then you have this new system. Well, let's get the community engaged in these schools in the poor areas, and one way to do that is to have the school governing bodies, and then some people made the next statement, and having them raise fees would be even better, because then that gives the local community a real financial investment in the school. I would not accept that second part of the argument, but it was made. But the idea was to try to get, or at least one of the justifications given, was to try to get some ownership. And this issue of ownership of the schools is really an important one, again, because of the legacy of apartheid, where the schools in the past were the enemy, because the schools were run by the nationalist apartheid government. And so you had to change that whole mindset. Now, it hasn't worked out all that well. A lot more needs to be done in getting communities together just to keep the schools safe. A lot of the schools now have barbed wire all around them. Some of them need more. I mean, this issue of crime and all sorts of things is something that the whole community has to play a role in. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to take some questions from the audience, and let's take, 3 or so. So I've got brown, green, and I'm talking about sweaters. Yes, first, second, and third. Okay. Is there a microphone somewhere? Oh, on the side. Sorry. No, we're recording this, and so it is important that we hear your voice. Okay. Thank you.
Just a question about HIV/AIDS education and how political it can be, and I'm wondering the structure, how it's woven into the framework of the school system, and how politicized is it within the country?
Okay, and let's take a series of questions because they may be interrelated.
I realize that you acknowledge the importance of language, but I just wanted to say that I would like to see added as one of your end lessons that language matters hugely in South Africa. I think all of the community efforts and so on, if one wants to involve the communities in education development, one needs an understanding of the extent to which communities can be cut off from the schools, because frequently the schools opt for English as language of instruction, whereas the majority of people probably don't speak English very well. So you find that school children have to learn in a language that is completely a foreign language to them and almost a foreign language frequently to their teachers. So for instance, I teach at the University of Cape Town, and I've encountered students at medical school who make comments such as, I learned my English in isiXhosa, so I learned my English in an African language. Their teachers frequently cannot teach them English, and yet the school, for economic reasons, because English is a language of opportunity, has opted for English as the language of instruction, which cuts off children from education and parents from involvement in their children's education.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Actually, the question slightly related to the last one really has to do with the teaching profession. I mean, obviously, improving the quality of the teaching force has got to be a key piece of the long-term strategy there. Do you get any sense of what the country's strategy is? Is there one? What's the composition of the force? How do you begin to attract and prepare the kinds of teachers that this country really is going to need?
Okay. Let me quickly address the HIV/AIDS issue. That's not something we looked at in any depth. There was also an issue which in 2002, when we were there, was only beginning to get onto the radar screen. As you know, President Mbeki was in a huge state of denial over this, and probably still is to a large extent. We asked a lot. We would ask principals, your colleagues, and say, have you lost any faculty? Occasionally, you might get somebody who would say, yes, there was a teacher. Usually they would say, well, we know that some parents of some of our students have died of AIDS. But they were still very much in a state of denial. And then if you look at the data that's come out since then, it's just a huge, devastating problem because, as you know, it really disproportionately affects the middle class and teachers in particular. So it's a huge issue. But
And there are people in South Africa looking at the ways that students are now being educated about AIDS, but that's not something that we looked into. Let me just pick up on the language issue. You're exactly right, and I just talked about it briefly here, but we talk about it quite a bit more in the book. We're not language experts, but we had lots of contact with people who were, and we couldn't agree with you more, and we did try to document some of the points you made. So we looked, for example, in the African schools, in the township schools in Cape Town, we looked at how many teachers who were teaching in English, spoke English at home, and most of them don't. So we provided empirical evidence that documents some of the problems that you're referring to. But we agree with you and think the country does need to grapple with this language issue. On the teacher issue, I would like to report to you, Bob, that there is a long-term strategy that is carefully thought through to deal with the teacher teaching force. And that's an area, and perhaps I should have highlighted at the end, where there has not been much progress for all sorts of complicated reasons. They were laying off teachers in places like the Western Cape, right and left. They were shutting down, and so some people weren't going into the teaching profession because there was all this discussion in the media about teachers being laid off. And then they were shutting down all the teacher training institutions in the homelands and the institutions that had trained, in some cases not very well, the teachers in those systems, and moved those into the university system. But the result of all of this is they're not training enough teachers now. And every estimate we saw, and we talk about this at the end of the book, has a significant shortage of teachers projected. And that's even before you bring in the AIDS deaths. And so when you put that all together, they've got a huge problem ahead of them that unfortunately they have not been able to address in a systematic way.
I think we have time for another round of questions. If you'd raise your hand and make your way to the microphone, please. Okay. And again, we'll take a round of questions and then come back to the panel.
I'm just curious to know, in conducting your research, obviously pulled together a lot of information and done a lot of analysis, what you found on the ground in terms of assessments and evaluations that were happening periodically in the school system, if they're happening, the quality of evaluations and assessments that are happening within the system.
My question has to do with university education. As university education has been more accessible to people who weren't able to go before, how have they been able to accommodate for the deficiencies of their elementary and secondary school education?
Okay. Go ahead.
I was curious about the culture in the schools and how, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but I know in our country and in South Africa it seems like the school systems are very traditional European structures, and they're not African structures. And we've struggled with that here ourselves in schools that are really dominated by white middle class cultures and dealing with kids that come from really different cultures. And I know Al's struggled, like what I hear you talking about in terms of involving community in different ways gets at that a little bit. But I'm just curious if there is conversation there about how do we create an African system of education and not a European system.
Okay. And the last question over here.
Hi, good evening. I actually have several questions. One, wondering about the number of students enrolled, and did you break it down by province and by urban versus rural schools? in terms of the primary school children. Two, I'm wondering about if you looked at unionism with teachers and how they've organized in South Africa, because I know they're a driving force. And even within unionism with teachers in South Africa, I know there are several sects within that, and if you looked at it all, I don't want to say turf, but anyone who's been oppressed, I understand there are different unions, and once you're affiliated with one, it's often difficult to work with another. And my other issue is resources. I mean, I know that one can go into some schools in KwaZulu-Natal and there are no books, no pens, no pencils, the chalk is locked up, and how much does this impact education? So it's very complicated, I understand. But.
Thank you. The answer to about 3 of your questions are somewhere in the book, and your challenge is to find out where those answers are. And the books are for sale right outside. So, let me just say something very briefly about assessments and evaluation, because we looked into that a lot. There's a lot of talk about it, and there are lots of small things going on, attempts at assessment and evaluation. They're really trying to move toward testing students in 3rd grade and 6th grade, and we would support that fully. So this is one of the policy implications that come out of this, which may not show up as clearly in the book, but as we talk about this in different settings, they really need to have some systematic evaluation of where students are now, so that 3 years from now they can see whether they're making progress with 3rd graders or with 6th graders. You can't just look at the matric high school exam. You really want to push it down. In terms of evaluation of teachers and other types of evaluation, they started out trying to set up evaluation systems for teachers. The teachers resisted, so they went to some whole school evaluation models. And they've been sort of grappling with that. Some of these haven't worked well. There's a model that they've been experimenting with in Gauteng that seems to be a bit more successful. It's called EAZ, modeled on sort of a French system of evaluation. And, it looks like that may be improving schools, so it's a whole school improvement evaluation system. But it's still very early on the whole evaluation front.
Just a couple of other points. In terms of higher education, we have a chapter on higher education. We didn't spend a huge amount of time looking at it. You have a similar situation where there were 33 institutions of higher education, many of which were set up in the homelands, designed to be dysfunctional, but only good enough to turn out some bureaucrats who would then work in the white-run bureaucracy in the homelands. And so the problem is that some of these are very low quality, but that's what they've got. So there's been a process that started when we were there in 2002 of trying to do some mergers. But if you can imagine what it's like to merge institutions of higher education in the United States, you have huge cultural differences. In the Western Cape, there were some pretty strong institutions, but they thought something in Western Cape had to get merged for political reasons, because you couldn't just let Western Cape off the hook and merge everybody else. And so they were trying to merge a university with a technikon. Well, if you understand the culture of higher education, that's a very difficult process to say the least. So, but they are trying to rationalize the system of higher education. I wouldn't say that they've made huge gains in getting in the flow of students out of secondary into higher education. There's a lot to be done there. On the matter of unions, yes, there are several unions. There is a COSATU, which is an organization embracing the various unions. The unions were very much allied with the ANC, so the unions were very much involved in the design of the post-apartheid education system. So the result is that they have a stake in the success of it because they were part of it. They didn't win all the battles. They lost some important battles. So the unions have this kind of tenuous relationship where they are functioning as unions, but they're not quite sure where they are politically. You have the ANC at this point really dominates the political process. one of the theories might be that eventually the ANC ought to split, like you'd have the equivalent of a social democratic party in Europe. And so you have the unions on the one hand, and then the powers that be of the emerging black middle class on the other, and it might become basically have a two-party system. But it's a young democracy, and that's not something that's happened. It might happen in 4 or 5 years. It might not happen for 30 years. But that's just a possibility. But so the unions have this very ambiguous role.
Let me just say a word or two about the culture question. That's a difficult one. We don't have a lot to say about it. But let me just emphasize it's complicated. It's not just the African schools where you might be concerned about preserving culture. The Afrikaners themselves want to make sure they can preserve their language and culture. And so they're white. And that complicates it. And they push for certain changes on their behalf that have implications for other schools. So we don't have a lot to say about the cultural issue, but it's a good one to pursue further. I just want to end coming back to one of your questions, Sue, which is, is South Africa qualitatively different than others? Or what conclusions can we draw? And I just thought it would be useful to tell you how Ted and I think about this issue and think about the countries we go in. We've looked at New Zealand on school choice and South Africa in terms of equity. From the perspective of a social scientist, which I very much am, it's useful to look for countries that have had bold changes, dramatic changes. It's like natural experiments. And if you can take those natural experiments and understand them fully, and it is, so the history being important is an important part of all of this. The hope is that then you can gradually draw out lessons for other countries, but it's the boldness and the dramaticness of the change, and South Africa certainly fits that. Now, where you go with all of this, we think there are lessons for the U.S. in terms of thinking about affirmative action or, whether race-blind policies are enough, and seeing how dramatic the challenges are and the changes are in South Africa, we think can provide insights for other countries.
Yeah, there's one other way we try to think about the comparison with the U.S., and that is, if you look at the United States and you look at South Africa, in terms of international TIMS and PISA and tests like this, what's striking about both countries is how polarized it is. The United States is notable among the developed countries because we have so many low-performing students on TIMS and PISA. We don't have the middle as much. We have some of the best, we have a lot of the worst. So you have this polarization problem. In that way, the United States and South Africa would share a problem. If you think of it in terms of magnitude, though, it's the flip of each other. We sometimes will say that South Africa is a third world country that has a first world country in its midst. The United States is a first world country that has a third world country in its midst. And that might be an interesting way to think about where the priorities are in terms of school reform in this country.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists tonight, Fiske and Ladd, Ted Fiske, and Al Witten, my co-respondent.